Yeah. But we've been talking about Catholic social teaching, and I'm not sure how familiar you guys might be with Catholic social teaching in general. Maybe some people have heard of it, or listen to a podcast. Catholic social teaching is a body of doctrine that the Church has been developing since the 1890s. And it's all about questions related to, let's say, the economy, politics, society. So as you may know, there was an encyclical published. And an encyclical is just a papal letter. It's something the Pope publishes under his name. An encyclical published by the last Pope, Leo XIII, in 1891, I believe, called Rerum Novarum. And that was addressing the Industrial Revolution. And that kickstarted the whole series of Catholic social teaching documents and encyclicals. So most of what we get of Catholic social teaching has been built up over the past 130 years. It's usually come in the form of encyclical letters, which are just letters the Pope publishes from time to time, exercises of the magisterium. And now, over the past 130 years, we have a pretty substantial corpus of texts of Catholic social teaching that form the bedrock of what we think and believe in this area. And we just got a new document this past week. I'm not sure if you heard, but Pope Leo published a document called De Lexi Te, which is, I think, Latin for I have loved you. And that's an apostolic exhortation on the poor. That came out on Thursday. It was signed on the Feast of Francis of Assisi, October 4th, but was released to the public on Thursday. So we have a new Catholic social teaching document just within the past week, which means I have to fix the material for next week, which talks about the poor, because it's out of date. But we're grateful for it. But today, so last week we talked about immigration. We talked about human dignity, which is the bedrock of Catholic social teaching. Human dignity, every human being has an infinite dignity, which is interesting. The Church insists on this idea that everyone has an infinite dignity. And its use of the term infinite is semi-controversial, because obviously there's a question of how can finite beings, human beings, have an infinite dignity. But the Church uses the term infinite dignity when it talks about human beings. And so we talked about that last week. And the question that we had for discussion, we didn't stay necessarily the question, like it kind of went round and round. But the question that we started with was, is any human being illegal? And we had some really cool perspectives on that from people. But yeah, it was a tie into immigration. So that's what we talked about last week. And today, we are going to be talking about things like stuff, like actual physical stuff, possessions, property. I mean, I guess immaterial assets too, but like stuff. And you may recall from the Gospels that Jesus had quite a bit to say about the relationship that a human being should have to material possessions. We have the famous injunction to not store up treasures on earth, or Jesus' demanding statement that if, no one can be my disciple if you do not give up all your possessions. So we have in the New Testament, in the Gospels, some pretty hard-hitting words from Jesus on the question of our relationship to material goods. And maybe the text in the New Testament that's the most condemnatory, the most prophetically condemnatory of wealth is from the letter, the epistle of James. And I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's pretty hard-hitting. And it goes, "Come now, you rich people." Welcome. There are a couple seats left. The text is from James. "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail." Yeah, I'll just wait. Welcome, Zhao. This is Zhao. What parish do you go to?
St. Patrick's.
Okay, we've just been doing names of parishes, so yeah. So the text from James, "Come now, you rich people, weep and wail for the miseries that are coming to you. Your riches have rotted and your clothes are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have rusted, and their rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous one who does not resist you." So that's from the epistle of St. James, which is in the New Testament. And I mean, that's pretty direct. And when we hear this, I think our tendency is to go, that's great, but that's not for me. I like the sentiment, but that's not for me. That doesn't really apply to my life today. But Catholic social teaching over the past 130 years has been all about how do we take these ideas from the gospel and apply them to the realities in our world today. And so that's what we're going to be looking at tonight. Material possessions how to live with them in today's context. And importantly, and we talked about this a lot last week, Catholic social teaching is not just about our relationship with material things. It's not just about what we do personally. It's about systems. It's about macro phenomena. It's about the economy. It's huge, right? Like Catholic social teaching condemns, and we talked about this last week here, like things that are like systematic, say. And so we talked about how like there are things that people don't expect, like subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions. All of these things and others that they're like are infamies indeed. And the Second Vatican Council, this is a text from the Second Vatican Council, condemns this, right? Subhuman living conditions, people treated as mere tools for profit, deportation without qualification. So these things, systematic things, big phenomena are condemned by the church. Not just our personal actions, but big kind of macro phenomena in the macroeconomy and in kind of social and political life. And today, of course, we're talking about money, which is, great. So let's talk about this. So the church has a lot to say about stuff, about possessions, about private property. And you may have heard in the past that the church believes in private property. And it's true. The church does believe in private property. The church affirms the right to private property. Since Rerum Novarum, since the 1890s, the church has affirmed that private property is a right that people have. And the Second Vatican Council said this in respect to private property. Private property or some ownership of external goods confers on everyone a sphere wholly necessary for the autonomy of the person and the family and should be regarded as an extension of human freedom. So that's one thing, right? And I'm sure you've heard this. The church supports private property. It's kind of something that's been circulating, right? But as you may have suspected, that's not the end of the story. Private property is a real concept in Catholic social teaching, but surprisingly, perhaps, it's not the most important concept when it comes to stuff about ownership. The more fundamental concept is something called the universal destination of goods. It sounds like a technical term. It is a technical term, but the more fundamental concept with respect to ownership and possession in Catholic social teaching is this phrase, the universal destination of goods. And you might sometimes hear the phrase, the common destination of goods. It means the same thing. But it's a very interesting concept. And what it means in essence is that the goods of the earth are destined for everyone. So the goods of the earth are meant for everyone. They're destined for everyone. So all this stuff, the resources, the things we need to survive, the church says that these things are for everyone, that everyone is entitled to their share of the goods of the earth, that everyone gets their share. That's the concept of the universal destination of goods. And so we have a text from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Church. And this is going to be pretty text-heavy, by the way, because as I said, Catholic social teaching is largely something that we get from these encyclicals, from these documents. The Compendium is not an encyclical, it's a compilation. But it says this about the universal destination of goods. Immediate significance is taken on by the principle of the universal destination of goods. God destined the earth and all it contains for all men and all peoples, so that all created things would be shared fairly by all mankind under the guidance of justice tempered by charity. God gave the earth to the whole human race for the sustenance of all its members, without excluding or favoring anyone. For the sustenance of all its members. That's why it's universal, the universal destination of goods. The idea in Catholic social teaching is that the goods of the earth are meant to be shared fairly by all humanity, by all persons. Under the universal destination of goods, everybody gets their fair share of the resources of the earth. That's the principle. Following so far? Yeah. What's interesting is that the church, while it affirms a right to private property, because as we said, it does affirm a right to private property, it says that this right is secondary, that the right to private property is actually under this concept of the universal destination of goods. So the universal destination of goods is what is fundamental, and private property is derivative. It's secondary. What's fundamental is the fact that God created the world so that everyone can take from it what they need to thrive and to flourish. And so we have some magisterial quotes about this. So this is a quotation from Fratelli Tutti, which is an encyclical letter that Pope Francis published 5 years ago in 2020, during the pandemic, I think. And in one of the sections he says, sorry, I can move out of the way. The right to private property can only be considered a secondary natural right derived from the principle of the universal destination of created goods. And I'll share the slides in the St. Peter's WhatsApp chat after this, just so you have them. But that's what Pope Francis said in 2020 in an encyclical letter, which, again, are exercises of the magisterium, so they form part of the Church's doctrine. And earlier, in 1981, so 40 years before this, almost 45 years ago now, Pope John Paul II said, Christian tradition has never upheld the right to private property as absolute and untouchable. On the contrary, it has always understood this right within the broader context of the right common to use all the goods of the whole of creation. The right to private property is subordinated to the right to common use, to the fact that goods are meant for everyone. So that's interesting. Under the Church's doctrine, private property is not the fundamental concept. The fundamental concept is the universal destination of goods. But why is this? Why is there this relationship? The Church believes that the goods of the earth are meant for all people, but it also affirms this right to private property. Why does it do this? It does this because it believes that having private property can serve this goal of everybody getting their fair share. So if you are allowed to have your slice of the pie and call it yours, that advances this principle of the universal destination. If everyone gets to own their fair share, that means everyone gets their fair share, that goods are destined universally, and that's why there's this relationship. Private property exists for the sake of the universal destination of goods in the Church's thinking and not the other way around, right? But there's a limit to private property, which we will get to after our discussion for this week. So, just to recap, universal destination of goods, the idea that the goods of the earth are meant for all peoples. Private property, the Church says, we affirm that, but only as a secondary principle and only because the Church believes that private property advances the goal of the universal destination. If everyone gets to have ownership of at least a few things, that means they have their share, their slice of the goods of the earth, so the universal destination of goods is advanced in that way. That's what the Church says is the ideal relationship between these two goals. And so let's take a look at some interesting applications before we go into our discussion. The first interesting application is theft. As you may know, theologians have argued for a very long time that it is permissible, appropriate, morally acceptable for someone to take from the excess goods of another person if they themselves are in a situation of extreme need. Right, like you think of like Jean Valjean from Les Mis, like stealing a loaf of bread, like that. Theologians for a very long time have said that if you're starving and someone has a loaf of bread, you can take it if you're starving. And this goes back at least as far back as Thomas Aquinas, probably further back. But Aquinas says this: if the need be so manifest and urgent that it is evident that the present need must be remedied by whatever means be at hand, then it is lawful for a man to succor his own need by means of another's property. It is not theft, properly speaking, to take secretly and use another's property in a case of extreme need, because that which he takes for the support of his life becomes his own property by reason of that need. That which he takes for the support of his life becomes his own property by reason of that need. Interesting. Hang on to that thought, because the Church will actually develop that a little further. But this is Aquinas, and as venerable as Aquinas is, he does function just as a private theologian, and his opinions are not binding unless they're incorporated into formal magisterial teaching. But it is, this opinion is incorporated into formal magisterial teaching. And so, for instance, the Second Vatican Council says this in a document called Gaudium et Spes. It says that if one is in extreme necessity, he has the right to procure for himself what he needs out of the riches of others. So this idea that in a situation of need, you can take from the excess of others, theologians have long argued this. The Church has officially endorsed this, rubber-stamped this into its own official magisterial teaching. So that's an application. You can see how this is kind of working, right? Universal destination of goods. If you have nothing, you can take to survive. Now, I think this is pretty uncontroversial. Most of us, I think, would say that if you're in a pretty desperate situation, you should just, you can take food, you can take water, you can take what you need to survive. I think people would say that that's pretty reasonable. So it's not hugely controversial what the church is saying here, but what is more controversial is the fact that the logic works in the other direction. On the church's view, theft actually occurs in the opposite direction. It's the rich, the people who have hoarded more than what they need, who are stealing from the poor. And this is the view, again, going back to in Christian history, of many saintly church fathers and prominent figures in early church history. And these are just two examples, right? So John Chrysostom says this: "Not to enable the poor to share in our goods is to steal from them and deprive them of life. The goods we possess are not ours, but theirs." So that's John Chrysostom. St. Basil the Great: "When someone strips a man of his clothes, we call him a thief. And one who might clothe the naked and does not, should not he be given the same name? The bread in your hoard belongs to the hungry. The cloak in your wardrobe belongs to the naked. The shoes you let rot belong to the barefoot. The money in your vaults belongs to the destitute." So in early Christian history, and these are just two examples, there are more. There are other saints, especially in early church history, that expressed a very similar sentiment. So going back quite early, we have this sense from multiple church fathers that if you have the ability to give to the poor, in some sense, and you do not, in some sense, you are committing theft, which is interesting. But as I said, until something is taken and incorporated into magisterial teaching, it's not official teaching. It's just the work of private theologians. But it has been incorporated into the official magisterium. And so we have this quote from Paul VI, Pope St. Paul VI, in an encyclical letter called Populorum Progressio, which was published in 1967. And he says, he quotes St. Ambrose, and who was famously, of course, the mentor of St. Augustine. And he says this in Populorum Progressio, which is quite like a groundbreaking encyclical for many reasons. But he says this: "The fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms. As St. Ambrose put it, you are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You have been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, not to the rich." So, again, this is the Pope in 1967 incorporating this sentiment from the early church into official Catholic teaching. And I think it's clear that this is the more radical position, right? Like I think it's clear to everyone that if a poor person steals a loaf of bread, like Jean Valjean and Les Mis, it's not theft. Or at least shouldn't be prosecuted as theft or treated as theft by any reasonable standard. But the church goes further and takes a more radical position and says that in this situation, it's actually the person who has excess that is committing theft. So that's one application. The second application, and this is going to kind of make more sense to those of you who were here for week one, where we talked about immigration. We talked about human dignity in immigration and how the church, we have some quotes from the church. Let's just take a look at one. So this is another social encyclical called Pacem in Terris. "Among man's personal rights, we must include his right to enter a country in which he hopes to be able to provide more fittingly for himself and his dependents. It is therefore the duty of state officials to accept such immigrants." So we grounded this in human dignity. But what's interesting is the church also uses this concept of the universal destination of goods to talk about immigration. So, there we go. You might remember that we looked at a quote from Pope Francis last week, where Pope Francis said, "Each country also belongs to the foreigner, inasmuch as the territory's goods must not be denied to a needy person coming from elsewhere. There are fundamental rights that precede any society because they flow from the dignity granted to each person as created by God." I'm sorry, that's not the full quote. The full quote would be in last week's. It was here. "We can say then that each country also belongs to the foreigner, inasmuch as the territory's goods must not be denied to a needy person coming from elsewhere. As the bishops of the United States have said, there are fundamental rights that precede any society because they flow from the dignity granted to each person as created by God." So we talked about this. We talked about, clearly here, Pope Francis is talking about human dignity and how that relates to immigration. But he also, very, very interestingly, relates this concept to what we've been talking about the universal destination of goods. So the full quote, in context, goes something like this. A firm belief in the common destination of the earth's goods, which just means the universal destination of goods, right? A firm belief in the common destination of the earth's goods requires that this principle also be applied to nations, their territories, and their resources. Seen from the standpoint not only of the legitimacy of private property and the rights of its citizens, but also of the first principle of the common destination of goods, we can then say that each country also belongs to the foreigner. So the quote, I started it last week with this. Each country also belongs to the foreigner, but it starts with this idea of the universal destination of goods. And why does Pope Francis say this? What is he saying here? Well, he's saying, in effect, that we have this principle called the universal destination of goods. Everyone gets their fair share of the goods of the earth. That means the goods of the earth are meant for everyone and are meant to be distributed fairly amongst everyone. When someone is not getting their fair share, they have a right to take in cases of extreme need, take a loaf of bread in extreme need. But what the church also says is that they have a right to go to some other place where their needs can be met because of this same principle. It's just like when a poor person steals food. In the church's view, they're not really stealing because they have a legitimate right to the access of other people. Similarly, when the church says that when a person crosses a national border to make sure that their basic needs are satisfied, they're not doing anything wrong. Because the principle of the universal destination of goods means that, much like stealing a loaf of bread, they're doing what they need to survive. They're taking from the excess of some richer person or some richer country to satisfy the need of someone who's much more desperate, right? So that's how the universal destination kind of plays into this idea about nations. So that's quite a lot, and I know that's pretty theoretical, but universal destination is a very, very, very important concept in Catholic social teaching. It permeates all throughout these encyclicals because it has to do with what the church believes the earth is for. The earth is for everybody. And so the way it worked for the people who were last week, and you know this, so we kind of stopped here. We let these principles sunk in. We kind of ate some of the food, although there's not too much this week. We took a break here. We went into discussion, and then we did a wrap-up in the end to talk about what the church kind of teaches about these questions. So I think we'll do the same thing today. So the question that we built for this week was, should there be billionaires? And maybe we can take maybe like a couple minutes just to grab some food and just take a break for a bit. But let's say in 10 minutes, let's come back and let's have a discussion on this question and maybe any other questions about anything else we just talked about. So, what are your thoughts on the universal destination of goods or the idea of rich people hoarding stuff as stealing, and should there be billionaires? But first, let's take a break, maybe have some food, and go from there. So maybe, let's say by 7:50. But thank you all for participating in that discussion. I think that was really fruitful. We had a really, really big group this time. So if we have a group like this next week, maybe we'll think about splitting it in two ways, or maybe we'll just do one group. I don't know. But thank you all so much for participating. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. So as for this question, should there be billionaires? There's no number that the church puts forward in any document. And I wouldn't expect the church to put like a number in a document saying, beyond this amount, you should not have any more than this. But the church lays out a couple of ideas and principles in its magisterial teaching that kind of get at this question. We saw this quote from Paul VI before. I don't know what happened to my slides. Like, it just became... there we go. We saw this quote before, but there's more context now. The fathers of the church laid down the duty of the rich toward the poor in no uncertain terms. As St. Ambrose put it, you are not making a gift of what is yours to the poor man, but you are giving him back what is his. You've been appropriating things that are meant to be for the common use of everyone. The earth belongs to everyone, and not to the rich. These words indicate that the right to private property is not absolute and unconditional. No one may appropriate surplus goods solely for his own private use when others lack the bare necessities of life. In short, as the fathers of the church and other eminent theologians tell us, the right of private property may never be exercised to the detriment of the common good. No one, the Pope says in 1967 in this encyclical, incorporates it into magisterial teaching, no one may appropriate surplus goods solely for his own private use when others lack the bare necessities of life. That's a very direct statement. I mean, you can kind of, get your way around this statement by saying, for his own private use, you can accumulate goods for the sake of other people, perhaps. But it's still a radical statement. It's almost as radical as I said, not quite as radical as a statement from the Epistle of James. I mean, that was pretty hard-hitting. But as I said in the discussion, what the church is doing in Catholic social teaching is it's applying to the Gospels to real-life, contemporary problems and realities. And it's recovering the sense of moral urgency from the Gospels in respect of wealth and applying it to our context today. So no one, the church says, can appropriate surplus goods when others lack the bare necessities of life. I was actually reading, so this is again, a radical teaching. I was actually reading the new apostolic exhortation this week, and I'm only on section 30 or something. It's 120 sections, so I'm not quite there, but it's slow going. I was a lot better at reading before Instagram, but I was a lot better at reading before Instagram. It's now I'm reading, I found something interesting in what Pope Leo said. Pope Leo, referencing actually the passage from James that I started the session with, and quoting Pope Francis, says this: "The message of God's word is so clear and direct, so simple and eloquent, that no ecclesial interpretation has the right to relativize it. The church's reflection on these texts ought not to obscure or weaken their force, but urge us to accept their exhortations with courage and zeal. No ecclesial interpretation has the right to relativize it," these teachings. And he brings up that passage from James. So he says that, there's a desire on the part of the church not to water this down. How we live it is one question, but we want the full moral force of the statements, And how did it go? Let's see. Sorry, it's all the way up here. "You have lived on the earth in luxury and in pleasure. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Your gold and silver have rusted, and the rust will be evidence against you, and it will eat your flesh like fire. You have laid up treasure for the last days. Listen, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, cry out, and the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts." I mean, that's hard-hitting stuff. And what Pope Leo just said literally last week was we can't relativize that. We can't water that down. That has to hit us with the same moral force that it was written with, right? Sorry, I'm getting back to my place in the notes. But, how do we actually do this, right? How do we actually practically discern how to do this in our lives? And what the church will say, and what Pope Leo, the last Pope Leo, the 13th, said in Rerum Novarum, the very first social encyclical of modern Catholic social teaching in 1891, I think, proposed that there are 3 levels. At the bottom, first level, everyone is entitled to what they need to survive. So you get your base level, level 1, everyone is entitled to what you need to have to survive. There's a second level, and the second level is everyone is entitled to what's appropriate for their standing in life. And this is where it gets kind of trickier, right? What's appropriate for your standing in life? I mean, it's a question of discernment, right? Maybe I, as a person who doesn't need to wear a suit that often, am entitled to own a suit, maybe 2 suits. But maybe a lawyer is entitled to own 15, right? That's what it means. Your standing determines, in part, what is appropriate for you to have. And that's dependent on context. It's dependent on your profession. It's dependent on, of course, your circumstances. So that's one level. You're entitled to what is required to survive. Second level, you're entitled to what's appropriate for your standing in life. And the third level, anything beyond that has to be treated as if it were held in common, right? And the church will even say, actually, I know I said these 2 levels, but in Gaudium et Spes in the Second Vatican Council, the church says, you are obligated to give to the poor and not merely out of your superfluous goods. So even out of the goods that are not superfluous, even out of those bottom 2 levels, you are still obligated to give. So it's a hard-hitting statement. And the final thing I want to bring up, and this is because it's Catholic social teaching, it talks about broad economic issues, broad issues about the state, about political power, about the economy, stuff like that. The Church also says this, and this is, one of the most radical statements I find. When the state brings private ownership into harmony with the needs of the common good, it does not commit a hostile act against private owners, but rather does them a friendly service. For it thereby effectively prevents the private possession of goods from causing intolerable evils and thus rushing to its own destruction. When I first shared this with one of my friends, he was like, this is the biggest case of gaslighting I've ever seen. But can you imagine? When the state brings private ownership into harmony with the needs of the common good, it does not commit a hostile act against private owners. Essentially, when the state takes the excess from people, it does not do them any wrong, but rather does them a friendly service, for it thereby effectively prevents the private possession of goods from causing intolerable evils. So on the Church's view, appropriate political authority is entitled to take the excess that some people might have and distribute it in such a way that the universal destination of goods is respected. So that's another application. So personally, there's these three levels. First level, you're entitled to what you need to survive. Then you're entitled to what's appropriate for your place in life. And then beyond that, you should treat what you have as held in common. That's the personal level. On the macro level and the state level, the Church says the state has the right to make it so that your excess serves the universal destination of goods and the common good. So two sides of the same coin, perhaps. But I don't know. Obviously here we don't have an answer from the Church. We don't have yes, there should be billionaires. No, there shouldn't be billionaires. But we have these principles that I think go a long way to helping us answer the question. And that is, I believe, it for week 2. So thank you all so much for coming. Our next session is next Tuesday at 7 p.m. We're going to talk about a concept called the preferential option for the poor, which is a topic that, it comes out of Latin American liberation theology, but it's been incorporated into magisterial teaching to the point where just this past week, Pope Leo mentioned it in his recent apostolic exhortation. So that's on the agenda for next week, preferential option for the poor. And last thing, if you are not part of the WhatsApp group for the St. Peter's Young Adults group, which we kind of use as our bulletin board, just ask me or Ivana or Victor, and we can add you. So that's it for this week. Thank you all for coming, and I hope to see you next week.